Hello and welcome back to Bodybuilding with Victor Frankenstein. My name is Sophie Marie, and for those of you who have been listening for a while, I took a few months off because I got married, and I unfortunately just did not have as much time as I wanted to prep all of the episodes I have planned for the coming months. There shouldn't be any month breaks in between now and those other episodes. So let's just plow back into the Frankenstein Chronicles. Today we are going to discuss the final 3 episodes of the Frankenstein Chronicles, kind of. I had originally planned to do one more full episode breakdown and then an analysis video. As I kept going with the show and my breakdowns, I really felt like I couldn't make the plot any less nonsensical and difficult to follow. So I just felt like my breakdowns were probably all over the place. So for today, I'm actually just going to explain how each of the plot threads are wrapped up, what happens to major characters, and then move on into an analysis of the whole show. Hopefully that sounds good, because that's what I have for you today. As per usual, we have some content warnings, just given the fact that we are discussing Frankenstein. So for today's content warnings, we are discussing medical abuse, murder, mutilation, plague, abuse of the poor, harmful terms used for the mentally ill, and a light little bit of religious abuse, among a little bit of like racist tropes. There's a lot. This show has a lot going on. So to start with, the Frankenstein Chronicles is 2 seasons. Each season has 6 episodes. It's pretty clear with the plot that the second season gives to us is that they were planning on having a 3rd season going forward. I have checked. There is no 3rd season on the books currently. According to Netflix, this show has neither been canceled nor renewed. So this does leave pretty much all of the plots unfinished, or if they are meant to be the finality of some of these plots, which I think they are, really unsatisfying. Let's start with our main character, Sean Bean, aka John Marlett. I think the season starts really strong. We've discussed the inklings of Marlett sort of rediscovering his post-reanimation identity. Those really get dropped almost immediately. Ultimately, his characterization is lost as the show progresses and it becomes a little bit more plot heavy. And I kind of feel like Marlett stops being our protagonist and is more a messenger and driver for subplots than he is an actually like fully fledged character. As much as season 1 is a mess, I do think Marlett is a character with morals that are driving him. In this one, he's just not much of anything. So I don't feel like I can just do a description of everything he does, because he is intertwined, if poorly, with 2 of the major plots of this season. And that specifically is the plague on Pie Street and that sort of political machinations that have to do with that, and the subplot with Mr. Dipple and the seamstress, whose name I learned finally watching these last 3 episodes is Esther. So let's hop in to a couple of the other characters and their plots, and we will kind of find Marlett along the way. So first and foremost, the Harveys. They were our main antagonists and love interests of season 1. They are pretty much gone through all of season 2. Lady Harvey, we have learned in the first couple episodes that she is dead. She remains dead. We only get her ghost in that first episode. She is referenced once in, I believe it's the second to last episode, when Marlett and Lord Harvey finally have sort of an emotional confrontation. And basically, Lord Harvey says that she made her sacrifices and that she knew what she was doing, and it's left it at that. The audience is never given any explanation of how she died in a way that makes sense with her character. It really does feel like they just needed her to not be there for whatever reason. and she was written out. But we do learn that Lord Harvey and Mr. Dipple are working together. We'll move right on to that. So we've learned that Mr. Dipple is friends with Ada Lovelace, who you guys know my opinions on introducing historical characters and then doing absolutely nothing with them. Ada Lovelace is dropped just as quickly as Mary Shelley was, mostly because of I was right, the potential flirtation between Dipple and the seamstress Esther. So just a quick reminder, Mr. Dipple and Ada Lovelace have been making some automatons, and Esther, the seamstress, has been hired to make dresses for those automatons. I mentioned this earlier, I think that automatons and the sort of discourse around them in the Victorian era is very interesting and very fruitful discussion in regards to Frankenstein and sort of its topics and themes. I think I would actually like to do a research-based episode on that history for you guys. That's not going to be today. That's a lot of information. But unfortunately, I do feel like Dipple's fascination with his sort of creating mechanical life is dropped because for more in favor of making his relationship with Lord Harvey make sense. So we learn, I believe in the second to last episode, that Marlett is not the first successful case of reanimation that Harvey has accomplished. That is Lord Dipple, or Mr. Dipple. Sorry, he's not a lord, he's just rich. And that Dipple's father is basically the person who created the science or the theory behind the science that Harvey has been using this whole time. We see him drinking these sort of elixirs that make him healthy so he can continue on living. So Dipple and Esther, the seamstress, do have this flirtation. He asks her to marry him. She's very hesitant. He's kind of a big weirdo, but she's into it. She's a little into it. So he introduces her to Lord Harvey, and basically we'll get to how he convinces Esther to go ahead with being killed and reanimated in a bit, but she does. She goes ahead with it. And through some not entirely clear means, Marlett finds out about this and he intervenes. He ends up rescuing her, leaving Lord Harvey and Dipple to basically run away into the night. And he gives Esther because now she has this, she is undead like him and Dipple. She doesn't really know where she fits in the world. We will come to talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, but basically, Harvey gives her to that traveling theater company that was performing Frankenstein earlier, and she ends the season by leaving with them. Something that I did like about this was it feels like both a little bit of Bride of Frankenstein, but also a little bit of the later elements of the book where the monster is asking Victor for a partner. There are a few lines where Dipple tells Marlett when they're having some not quite theological, but like moral debates about turning Esther and how Marlett believes that he shouldn't have done this, but Dipple wants someone who can be with him forever. And there's some references to one day Marlett will understand that he will also need a companion. That, unfortunately, is never fully discussed, mostly because, Marlett and Esther run away and then the season ends and we have no season 3. So that's a conversation and an introduction of the Bride of Frankenstein story plot that I just don't think gets enough time. Like, I honestly think it would have been, I don't know, and maybe this is an issue with having such short seasons that we just don't get these plots fully developed in a way that makes a lot of sense, or 2 is in any way a full season arc. Not necessarily like a full show arc, but it's not even one full season arc, and I think that's disappointing. So I had referenced that Dipple found a very specific way to convince Esther to go through with this sort of transformation. And it will lead me back into another sort of strange, undefined subplot. And this subplot is the hauntings that are seemingly happening to Marlett. So we see in the very first episode that he sees Lady Harvey's ghost. He sees Esther's dead child, which I think I mentioned in my last episode that I didn't know if that was a hallucination or an actual haunting. It is confirmed, yes, it is a haunting. And he also sees the dead folks who have been poisoned due to this sort of plague on Pie Street. And like I said, I didn't know if it was a hallucination, because hallucinations were an element of season 1 due to his, I believe, syphilis. And in this one, they're not hallucinations. It is confirmed, at least to the characters, that they are seeing ghosts. And basically the reason that is given is that because they are something other than alive, they can now see folks who have passed on. And I think that's a super interesting idea. That sort of blending of, they're not undead in the way that vampires might be, but they're also not quite zombies. So what does that mean for people who have passed on, people who are still living? Like, they don't exist in the same plane. I do like that idea. I think it is used in a way that is a little cheap. So basically, we do also learn that these characters cannot see, as Marlett says, their own dead. So they don't see their loved ones who've passed on. And that means that since Dipple can see, because he is also reanimated, Esther's dead son, he basically convinces her to go through with the reanimation in hopes that she can reconnect with her son. But he does not tell her. It's unclear if he doesn't know or if he just doesn't care and is just using this purely to manipulate her for his own gain. But he does not tell her that she will not be able to see him. This does cause her some distress. There's a really kind of lovely and haunting moment when she is leaving London with the theater troupe, and you see that Marlett can see that her son is sitting beside her in the wagon, and she can kind of feel him but not see him. And I do think that there's this sort of beautiful idea in there somewhere of letting go of our grief, letting go of the past, even though we still sort of wear it. But I can't quite tell if that's what the show is going for, if that is me really just reading too far into this. So those are, I think, a couple of the main plots that have to do with Marlett, that have to do with anything, even kind of relating to the plots, not the plots, but the themes of the novel, the themes of other adaptations. But there is one more character that I have a lot of feelings about that I want to discuss before I kind of go over my overall thoughts on the show in general, and that's Nightingale. So I've discussed before that I think some of the characterization of Nightingale is clunky at best, rooted in potential harm at worst. I do have to say, I think he's an interesting character. I think he's one of the better acted characters. And he, like Flora before him, is treated cruelly. So in season 2, he has been promoted within the police force. And there is this sort of subplot where these bishops have been murdered. That is something else that, as the season progresses, is there, but not enough to matter. And that's going to be a huge critique of mine later in this episode, is the fact that a lot of stuff just gets dropped. So during these murders, Nightingale, finds reanimated John Marlett. He believes John is the person committing these murders, and he goes to his superiors. His superiors obviously don't believe him. John Marlett has been dead for years. But he begins to confide in a friend of his. We've mentioned her a little bit before. I think she's named. I unfortunately did not include her name in my notes. And when I went to find her actor later, cannot find her. So she is the maid to Mr. Dipple. She's the one that Nightingale is seemingly friends with. He's become friends with her during the interim between seasons. She's the one who finds Dipple's kind of creepy doll room. It's established throughout the season that they are very close. She might have a romantic feelings for him. He does not. He's still very much mourning Flora, but they are good friends. And I cannot tell you, because it is so nonsensical, but I cannot tell you how this happens other than Nightingale is looking for Marlett. He wants to bring Marlett in. And he is caught by Lord Harvey, who he believes is dead. And without ceremony, Lord Harvey murders Nightingale. It's shot in a way that is quite, it's not quite clinical, but it's quite graphic, and it's just so sudden. And basically what happens immediately after is, as he's dying, Nightingale appears to Marlett because, he can see ghosts, and he tells him that he is sorry, that he now believes him about Lord Harvey. He no longer believes that Marlett faked his execution or anything like that. He believes in the reanimation. And that is it. And that is how Nightingale dies. In the end of, I believe it's either the third to last or second to last episode. It's very unceremonious. And he does appear one more time to Marlett with Flora in ghost form, very, very briefly. He's really just sent out in a way that, quite like Flora, in my opinion, that is just kind of cruel. And it's only used to not even, I feel like, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I feel like Flora's death was cruel, but used to push forward the plot, which I don't really entirely agree with. But Nightingale, I think his death was supposed to push the plot forward. All it really does is make Marlett feel guilty and kind of trick us into believing that it's pushing the plot forward. It feels lazy, it feels cheap. I was actually really angry when I turned the episode off. So that's Nightingale. I think a lot of my later opinions about the show are very much colored by the lazy writing and the cruel writing, and I just feel like Nightingale's death really encapsulates that. So there's a couple other, actually that's not true. There's one more subplot that I want to talk about before we kind of go on to my overall thoughts. And that's the plague on Pie Street. It serves no purpose. There is this political subplot with the bishops being murdered and the church and the state sort of vying for power over this street. It does come out that Dipple is trying to buy Pie Street as well, so Marlett believes that he's the one who's poisoning people to get them to leave, so he doesn't necessarily have to let them live on the land. They'll already be gone. That is never confirmed. It just sort of, once the interpersonal drama between Dipple, Marlett, Harvey, and Esther begins, the political machinations really just stop mattering. And unfortunately, without a season 3, there's no indication of how that subplot was supposed to progress. And one thing that also bothers me, given how seasons 1 into 3 function, is that there's a lot of political stuff happening with the Anatomy Act and with, Lady Harvey. She gets married in the end of season 2, and her husband is never brought up after her death. The politics of the Anatomy Act are never brought up in season 2, which is only 3 years later. That is still an act that would have active consequences on people's lives, especially poor people, in the coming years. And when you have people like Dipple, who's, questioning what creating life really means, that, brings up what is God, what is the afterlife, and things like the Anatomy Act that are huge plot points and thematic plot points in season 1 are just never brought up in season 2, which all of that is to say that this subplot of Pie Street, I don't really have faith it would be brought back up in season 3. There's no indication that this show really cares about the politics, and I think that is a shame. Victorian England is a messy, messy place, a dark place. And by bringing in historical figures, historical politics for your fantasy horror show, I do think you should deal with those politics, those themes, those ideas in a way that is meaningful. And I think the one thing the show does is not deal with its themes in a meaningful way. I think it goes more for shock value and aesthetic. And I think that is a shame. All of this is sort of to say I'm very confused by what this show is trying to accomplish. There's thematic oversights almost, like the afterlife is canonically a thing in this world, in this story, but these characters are still vying for everlasting life. In this world, I don't know if the show is trying to make a statement or a point about the sort of human fear of the unknown outweighing everything. I don't know if the use of the Anatomy Act versus Esther's manipulation into her reanimation and Marlett's non-consent to his reanimation is trying to have a deeper, more complex understanding of human bodies in regards to medicine, in regards to maybe just the politics of Victorian England, or maybe politics now. Like, I don't know what the show is trying to say, and I'm actually like having a hard time trying to even create a thesis around this show to get across to you guys how I think it maybe fails at producing its own thesis, or if it's successful or not within its own thesis, because I don't think this show really has one. I think that's a shame. I don't think this show has a thesis. I fear that the lack of cohesiveness between seasons, the character plots and characterization as well just sort of getting dropped is, I think it is emblematic of the entire structure and execution of the show. And I think that's a shame. I do feel like after my little rant that my feelings on this show are clear. Unfortunately, I did not like it. The positives for me is that it is visually a lovely show. There are times when the visuals almost cross into like purely atmospheric art house-esque style. It can be really captivating, and the actors are putting themselves out there and giving pretty good performances. Like I said, I think Nightingale's actor is maybe one of the best. He really sells it. I just wish that these actors were given more developed characters to play, because they're trying with what little they have. I think this is especially true for Marlett, because Sean Bean is a great actor, and I was really bored whenever he was on screen. And that's mostly because Marlett goes from a potentially interesting character into like a brooding nothing boy, which anyone who's watched, I feel like, any show, especially any procedural with this sort of character, it has been hammered over the head. That's another issue, is I don't really know if this show knows what it wants to be. It is half procedural, half horror fantasy, half adaptation of the novel, and half sort of cultural examination of the Victorian era. And it just doesn't do any of those things to a high enough degree to, I think, justify how chaotic it feels. Overall, there are some really fun moments. Costuming is great. The themes come in flashes, but are never quite given the time or exploration they deserve. Characters are introduced so quickly, and names and personalities are so unattached that the intrigue that I think is supposed to be propelling this chaotic storytelling forward is more confusing than interesting. The poor construction of characters and scenes themselves means that absolutely no subplot feels like there's any completion, and it also leaves you as a viewer kind of just going with it and not really understanding what's happening. It's kind of just vibes. I was never asking myself questions as watching. I was just kind of going along because the plot was kind of by the numbers while desperately attempting to explore more complex ideas. But it's almost like it was by the numbers, or like paint by numbers, but scribbling outside the lines, so it was hard to follow and boring. I think that's a horrible combo, and I hate saying that. I mentioned this before, the thing that to me boggles my mind the most is the addition of the automatons in this story of unending life, or of ending death itself. What do they mean? What are we exploring through them? It's made clear that they are not sentient, but there's these lingering shots as if they could be, and that's never really explored. I really think that the automatons are just there for yet another historical oddity, such as the Anatomy Act, and I don't think there's anything more. One more thing that I'm going to rant about, quite briefly, is that there is a moment, I do not remember what the character's name, who this was with, I believe it was the royal coroner, who is such a nothing character that I do not believe I've ever